Energy Transition 92, Energy Trends in 2024. Happy New Year, Tammy Nimet, David Blackman, Stuart Turley.
Happy New Year.
Happy New
Happy
Year.
New Year, everyone.
David, are you planning to use an e-bike to go to the next OTC in Houston?
Probably not. Probably not. After that subway fire in Toronto that was caused by an exploding e-bike battery that was brought onto the train, I think I'll forego riding those bikes in the future.
My God. And the train is subway or is a
It was a
normal
subway
train?
train,
Subway.
subway train, and luckily
Impressive.
there were nobody injured. Thank God, everyone was able to get out safely, and it took them a while to contain and put out the fire, but it's apparently out now.
Impressive. People, I was planning, and I would like to see if you agree that we could separate in four steps our conversation today. Energy source, which ones will grow faster? Energy security, if you do you have some expectation about this issue? Energy restriction by geopolitical influences, maybe get worse or not. I'm not sure. And mergers and acquisition are everything related to big oil. They are pressure or not in this sense. So, if you
Great.
agree, yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So let's start with the first point. David, you would like to start to be the one to start our conversation?
Sure. Yeah. I think that, and I'm in the process of writing a forecast column for Forbes that I do every year. And I think it's kind of obvious, kind of baked into the cake, that solar probably is going to be the fastest growing energy source across the globe and in the United States this year in the Western world. The subsidies in place they're baked into the cake, and they're going to be heavily influential for the next 7-8 years. Wind is probably not going to grow nearly as quickly as solar, and probably not as much of an expansion as it even had in 2023, which was a disappointing year for wind, really, because there are just so many problems with wind now that are popping up as the older wind farms get older, and we find out that the turbines don't really last anything close to 25 years, and all the maintenance issues. And now there's a pretty rapidly growing protest movement to new wind farms in the United States that Robert Bryce has done a fabulous job of documenting. So I think wind is going to have a tough year. Oil and gas will expand just like it has the last 2 years on a very steady pace to meet global demand. We'll probably have an increase in global demand somewhere around 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day. And I expect the United States and Brazil, frankly, Brazil's offshore province, to fill a lot of that new demand. And so it's going to create pressures on OPEC and OPEC Plus as a result. Coal is, being essentially outlawed by governments in the Western world. But in the developing world, coal is still king, is going to remain king, will continue to expand, and we'll probably use more coal again this year than we ever have in human history. And I don't expect that trend to subside anytime soon. Nuclear, it's just hard to know. Unfortunately, the developments in the new technology are, kind of slow in coming, and governments, regulators are very plotting and modifying their regulatory structures for nuclear. And you still have all the protests raising alarm that's really not justified about nuclear. So it's still got a lot of problems.
Mm-hmm. Then you see the government wants the same that society wants in terms of energy.
Well, it depends on where you are in the world, right? Because, in the European Union, the governments want something different than what the people want. And, the people want reliable, affordable energy that they know will be there when they need it, that it's secure. And the government instead is embarking upon a different pathway. And the same in the UK, where, people in the UK want to make sure when they turn the heat on, the heat's on, not, and is affordable, not like the new heat pumps where you can turn it on, it'll whir away and not necessarily keep your house warm. If you like it at 16 degrees Celsius, okay, maybe in the winter, but most people would prefer it to be around 20, which doesn't happen. And I think one of the interesting aspects in the UK is that there's all this talk about increasing oil and gas production in the North Sea and whatnot, but the government is talking that way, but the companies aren't buying it because there's an election this year, and the party that seems poised to take control said they would cancel any leases that were granted. So companies are of course holding back on whether or not they pursue this or not. And in respect of Canada, the government announced, I think it was at COP28, they're going to do a hard emissions cap on oil and gas production in Canada. And a hard emissions cap is basically a production cap. So, they're telling oil and gas producers in Canada that they're going to be limited on how much they can produce. So even though the developing world will probably increase demand, as David has said, and I agree with pretty much everything David has put forward, Canada won't be able to contribute to that. The same, there were when Germany came and when Japan came begging Canada, please support your friends. Can you export some more natural gas? And the government told them, don't talk about that publicly. We're going to talk about hydrogen. So, it's very clear that the Canadian government does not want to follow what the people want, because the people in Canada also want secure, affordable, reliable energy, and the Canadian government is doing everything in its power to do the opposite.
Yeah.
Stuart, if you have $100 and you have the options to bet in this energy source, how much you can bet in each one?
How much I can bet on each one? Holy smokes, Batman! Welcome to Monday or Tuesday. I'll tell you. Here's the funny. That's a great question, Armand. Let me answer it this way. In COP28, we had so many head explosions from the climate activists because oil and gas. Wasn't that fun, David? I mean, when we sit back and kind of go. They all went back, and when they snuck in, natural gas is really needed. There was a resurgence to nuclear, and Hugo Kruger basically said, just recently, the median countries will excel in nuclear. We've seen that in Japan. We've seen that in France is now kicking back in. Germany's going to coal. The U.S. is not going to increase its fleet because of the legislation through regulatory issues. This is all tied back to the climate thing. So before I started losing my money, that's thanks to Bidenomics, that's all I've got is $100 for this year. And that is the war that is also on food is out there as well, too. So when we sit back and take a look, which ones are going to, I think, David, you are dead on right. Solar is going to kick in huge. Natural gas is going to really kick in huge. But Armando, I don't get it why the climate activists, and I'm not a Kerry fan. And when you sit back and take a look, the only reason we lost or reduced our carbon footprint was because of natural gas. Why don't we support natural gas as a great transition to get us past? Natural gas should grow. Solar should grow based off of what I'm seeing. And wind farms, we've talked about, they are unprofitable from day one. I just heard some heads explode.
It's true. Even with subsidies, a lot of them are not profitable.
Yeah.
And they're never carbon zero.
Never carbon zero. It's a dream. The second point, in terms of energy security, it's so important point. What are your expectations? Starting with Stuart to see the expectations he has.
Well, Armando, thank you again for letting me be a Debbie Downer. But as men, and Tammy, I please take this with, we need to be providing for our families. There are natural disasters out there. There are things that could possibly happen. Get ready, have small electric generators, be able to survive for 24 to 72. And if you can survive for a long time without power, that's great. Solar, wind, love it for the house. Here's where energy security becomes a problem. The Chinese balloon that went over the US, in the US only, Tammy nailed it with the low cost energy. We need low cost, dependable. Our grid is vulnerable. In the United States, there are 30 major interconnects that China now can shut down. I'm not kidding. I'm working on some of that issue. David, I believe it was also the balloon is now documented that it tied to a national internet provider and that the Biden administration tried to keep this quiet. So now that it is connected and passed through the major interconnects that we bought from China, I'm interviewing Michael Yon tonight. Michael Yon is in Panama, and he has been tracking the Chinese army and folks coming in and what all that is about. So not only do we have the energy security, we have the FERC that has said, be prepared for blackouts. This morning, there was a major fire going on in New York City, and it has had some serious problems this morning. Explosions were happening. Can you survive as a family? The government may not be there to bail you out. So energy security around the world is about natural gas pipelines. That is the number one energy security. We also just had the great interconnect, the most expensive interconnect coming to the UK. I believe, Tammy, this past week, it was a huge interconnect coming in from, I believe, France. I mean, that's huge for them to be now energy dependent on another country. How's that for an answer?
And David, did you see that wind energy is the worst one in terms of energy security?
So grid security is a horrible issue in the United States for sure, and in many other countries. And the proximate cause of that is because we're overloading our grids with intermittent energy with no backup, no reliable backup, no sustainable backup. And so we're running out of reliable 24/7 generation capacity. Everybody's short on it. Here in Texas, ERCOT says we got about a 16% chance of having blackout conditions at some point this winter if we have any kind of a significant winter weather event in Texas. And, that's a situation that should never exist in the state of Texas. We produce a third of all the natural gas produced in the United States in Texas. Texas, if it were a country, would be the third largest producer of natural gas on the face of the earth. We should never have a situation in Texas where our grid has any threat of blackout conditions at all. So it's scandalous. It's borderline criminal that this situation exists. And policymakers in Texas had better get their arms around it pretty quick, or you're going to end up with a Democrat state again, because this is all happening on the Republican Party's watch. And that's my rant for today.
But is there, David, a special agenda for this, to put risks in the grid without necessary?
Well, it's just all part of the energy transition agenda. It's this. We've chosen these three rent-seeking industries, wind, solar, and electric vehicles, to subsidize into reality somehow with debt-funded subsidies put in place by the federal government. And the same thing's happening in Canada and the UK and throughout Europe and probably in Brazil too, all over the Western world. This is what we're doing. In the meantime, China continues to build all the coal plants it wants to build and needs to build.
Yeah.
It's become the second biggest importer of oil on the face of the earth. India is moving in the same direction China is moving. And the net result is going to inevitably be tremendous energy instability and insecurity in the Western world. And we're all going to be dependent on China for our energy security. And if anyone who thinks that's a healthy and sustainable condition for any Western nation to be in is most likely a traitor, quite frankly, and has a lot of financial interests tied up in China, kind of like a lot of people in this current presidential administration.
Hey, David, can I also validate what you just said though? With China, China's building the mega gas production area with over 40 billion cubic meters. They went just very shortly from 30 billion to 40 billion. And they've now, it says, quote unquote, it took us 13 years to increase the annual gas output from 10 billion to 20. It only took us 3 years to expand from 20 to 30. And they are bringing a whole nother big section online. Applaud China. Here's the problem. They've increased theirs 220% because of the coal. They're bringing on everything. They have all that. David, well said and well validated. I mean, sorry.
Tell me, the UK and Canada prime ministers, do they know exactly what's the meaning of energy security? Do you see
I don't think they know what energy security is, to be honest. If I could add to what Stu was saying about the interconnections, actually, the UK has had interconnections with France since 1986, and the new one I think that came online at the end of 2023, like just a few weeks ago, that was an interconnection with Denmark. So there's, if you go to the Ofgem website, ofgem.gov.uk, it talks about the current 6 gigawatts of electricity interconnections between the UK and Ireland, Netherlands, Belgium, France, and now Denmark. And then it has a list of the projects. So the UK is going to be importing more energy from France and possibly either importing or exporting to Germany. So the German one, I know, it's supposed to come online in 2028. So, the UK has been part of this integrated European project, right? And that Brexit threw a monkey wrench into all of that. And if Labour gets back in, I'm sure Brexit will be over and they'll once again double down on the whole needing to be interconnected with Europe. The problem is that with these interconnections, as with the grids and everything, if you're constantly expanding it, every time you do something, that becomes a choke point. It becomes a place where you can potentially make a country vulnerable with a terrorist attack or something else. And there's no redundancies built into these systems. So, David, I really enjoyed your conversation with Robert Bryce the other day, where he was talking about, yes, natural gas is great, but we still need the coal because natural gas is just in time. And coal, at least you can stockpile, you can slowly ramp it up, you can ramp it down, whatever. But it's a very, very stable source of electricity, which is why China is investing tremendously in their energy security. They have something of everything, right? More nuclear, more gas, more coal, more solar and wind or whatever, where that happens to make sense. Although I question them using that to the extent that they say they are. In any event, India, I think, is very interesting because the environmentalists made a big show and story when India said they were going to have a moratorium on new coal-fired power. And that was back in February or March. But in October, they said, oh, emergency, we need to build so many thousands of megawatts or gigawatts or whatever it is, but to increase significantly their coal power because they want secure, reliable energy. They care about their energy security. And all I can say with Europe and Canada and the UK, oh my gosh, get your heads out of the sand. Start thinking about the security because with what's going on in the Middle East, and I'm sure we'll get into geopolitics in a few minutes here, but there's all kinds of things going on that disrupt the flow and increases prices. And I know the environmentalists are making the argument, well, we should just invest more in wind and solar because then we're not beholden to these international powers for the price of oil or natural gas or whatever. And it's just the most ludicrous argument because who's controlling, as David said, the components and the production of the wind and solar? Well, that's China. So China suddenly holds back its rare earths, and now your costs have exponentially increased, or they put a tariff on your solar panel. So it's not like we make them in Canada, and we certainly don't make them in the UK. So yeah, okay, it's going to increase production in China, and then they can hold whatever they want over our heads with respect to price.
Please do not stop, Tammy. Go ahead with the geopolitical influences, and can it get worse in your opinion?
Well, sure, because so just at the end of the year, we had all of these new geopolitical issues starting, right? So we had the Venezuela and Guyana situation, which is unresolved. They're still building up. They're still kind of quasi negotiating how this is going to play out. It's an election year in the United States, as David and Stu have mentioned, which throws all kinds of different variables into the equation.
Yes.
Then you have what's going on with the Suez Canal and the Red Sea and the Houthi rebels going around attacking ships and so on. You have Iran coming into the fray there on the side of the Houthis. And it's like, okay, so now Iran has a warship there, or they're doing something in the Red Sea that affects that particular choke point, which is really a significant one. But I was looking on this map. You can find all the ships that are currently en route or whatever through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and the ones that are going around. Well, look at what companies own the ones that are continuing to use Suez. Well, sure, the European companies may be going around Africa now because they're targets. Are Chinese container ships, are Chinese tankers being targeted by the Houthis? I don't think so. So they get to the shortcut, and the Western countries have to go the long way around.
Wow.
Then you have China sitting there being the mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia to figure out what to do about Gaza and Israel. So China is now taking this kind of diplomatic position that they're the calm, sober mediator for these different things. And so maybe in 2024, they also become elevated in trying to resolve what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. What happens if that's resolved? Does the oil and gas trade get to continue as it was before? If Russia somehow makes some kind of settlement, do they continue with the sanctions? Can the EU permit the sanctions to be lifted when they're so close to achieving their aim of putting their people into energy insecurity? So I don't know. It's an interesting year. I think there's a lot of moving parts right now that can make things very interesting.
But David, you mentioned Brazil, and Brazil is now being friend of Russia and China, so being less West and more East friendship. How do you see, and being part of OPEC and BRICS? So please insert this variable in your comment, please. Go ahead.
Well, I think that's a very big deal. And, I've talked about that for the last year now. I think the expansion of BRICS, Brazil has always been a part of BRICS, but the expansion of BRICS to include the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, now makes, and a couple of other countries, it now makes BRICS not just really the largest, the most economically powerful global trade organization. It also, the members of OPEC now control more daily oil production than OPEC does, okay, with Russia and Saudi Arabia both in there. And so that means BRICS, being a part of BRICS now, I think is going to be heavily influential in Brazil's foreign policy outlook and its international outlook. And the same is going to be true. And we're seeing it, as Tammy noted, we're seeing it playing out in real time now. The same is going to be true with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. China is going to become the mediator of these disputes and not the United States. It's going to be a gradual displacement of U.S. influence really around the world. And a lot of that's going to be driven by BRICS as an organization. So, you have to give China credit. They're very smart. They are unrelenting.
Yeah.
They have a long-term outlook on all of this, where the United States just, in this administration in particular, just kind of doesn't seem to have any long-term outlook at all on anything. And we send our carrier groups in, and what did we do? We shot 3 little Houthi boats out on the water over the weekend and killed 10 of them, and that's been our big military objective in the Middle East now. So it's a real, I can't even say the word where U.S. foreign policy is concerned, and I just think China just is going to continue to gain influence in that realm.
Yeah.
And Stuart, if you've been flying with the president of Brazil in the same airplane, seat by seat, what could be your conversation with him?
Holy smokes, Batman! Wow. I'd look over because Putin would be in the same airplane, and that was a good one, wasn't it? And Putin would look at him and say, it's the way I think of the U.S. is it's mind over matter, and I'm paraphrasing Putin. So it's mind over matter because the U.S. doesn't matter because I don't mind. And what they've done is a beautiful job. Putin is now the president of BRICS this next year. So that's why he's in the plane with the president of Brazil. And I would be in there and I'd be firing up a podcast, and David would be right there. And then Tammy would be there, and we'd have a big old podcast going on with you leading the question. So I'm going to not you see where I went with this in my weird mind here. Now,
I don't know what any of that means, Stu, but I like it.
Hey, we're going to have fun. Now, here's what the big thing is, and that is the Monroe, I believe it's the Monroe Doctrine you brought up before, David, on this, and that is we are idiots in the United States and Canada, total idiots. We could negate OPEC by being a trader within our own hemisphere and wipe out their ability to do this over here. So here I am, I got Putin, and Putin has said, hey, I don't want to cut off the West, but the West doesn't matter anymore. So we have this paradigm, and I would like to be the guy out there, and I know David would not be able to do this because of his sense of humor. My sense of humor, I could get in there, and Tammy would be very, very sensible in the smart one in the room. So I would go out and I would say, guys, let's all work together. Let's work for energy security. Let's work for energy. And I think next week when Irina Slav comes on, we need to talk about OPEC and her great article that just came out today that was wonderful about OPEC's not dead yet. Yeah. I got a few points on it that it is losing some traction on the pricing matrices, because I think the oil matrices is messed up. Pricing matrices for oil has got the dark fleet, 600 tanker, all this. My head's exploding with what's going on, but I can't wait for that plane ticket, Armand. We're going to have a blast.
Can I add in there a little bit? Because I feel like Brazil is something like a double agent. Because Lula, I think, and I'm sure I'm wrong, but I think it's an interesting idea that Lula owes his position to the United States. I mean, the reason he won, I think, was due to support or interference from the United States.
Yes.
But but he kind of likes to be against the United States because of the whole South American sort of post-colonial idea. Yes. And so I feel like he's a spy in OPEC and the BRICS, giving some information back to the United States about what's actually happening within these groups and so on. Wow. But is a double spy because he also wants to assert the independence of Brazil, but he's still beholden somewhat to the United States. And so I have this idea that he's like this double agent kind of thing in there.
Yeah.
If I could add to what they were saying about the new BRICS members. So originally Argentina had been invited, but with the election of Milei, it's kind of on hold right now. So Egypt is a new member, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia. So we've got the 5 countries instead of the original 6 that were proposed because Argentina is in a state of flux at the moment. But even so, Egypt, Iran, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia. Those are, but aside from Ethiopia, I think those are 4 very strong countries in vis-a-vis OPEC and the oil and gas trade. And I think it's very significant that these Middle Eastern members are now part of the Brazil, South Africa, India, Russia, China connection.
But look at where Ethiopia is geographically and strategically located at the mouth of the Red Sea, and that it's just such a smart thing to bring Ethiopia into that organization for strategic geopolitical reasons. It's
Absolutely.
just you have to admire them. Very smart.
Yeah, they are growing very fast, and this is something that we need to take care of to see what can happen. But Brazil
that's
is
also
part
of
this
the
game.
Belt and Road Initiative, right? Where they have the train lines that go through and securing the shipping lines and making sure that the oil and gas trade and the other really important resources from Africa and North Africa will have now access to the China-India sort of market.
For example, Nigeria, Angola, they are producing more oil and gas, and being part of, I don't know what group they are.
Great points.
We have.
Is it a Central African group? I can't remember.
You cut out, Tammy. You said, ooh.
I know, it's okay.
What is
BRICS? Yeah. This is good. Yeah, we should have explained that. We kind of assume people know what BRICS is, but it is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a global trade organization created by those 5 countries. And it expanded in August to add the countries that Tammy listed. And as we mentioned, it now controls the members of that organization control more daily crude oil production now than OPEC does.
Yeah. OPEC is 30 million barrels a day, I suppose.
And BRICS is around 40.
More. Yeah. This is great. Let's go to the last point. That's for me is a very tricky point because mergers and acquisitions last year were very strong, very big. But big oil is, pressured, trapped to be green or not. So, Stuart, please tell a little bit about your vision for big oil in terms of green energy or transition and things like that.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the difference between the big oil and the European markets versus the big oil in the U.S. markets. I see a lot more mergers going on, but I also see mergers going along with the green. Big oil, if the markets would allow it, either the European, Middle Eastern, or they will become more quote unquote ESG or environmentally friendly based off of demand. And if demand is demanding that people do it, look at Texas. We've talked about that before. I applaud the big oil for doing it. You've got Total Energy, as I say here in Texas, that has bought enough natural gas power plants. They've divested it. I'm looking to see their financial statements to see how they bury that. But yet you're still seeing people buy renewable companies. There's all of that coming forward. So the big oil is going to be moving more green, and the big oil is also going to become better at ESG. They're also going to be doing better at giving money back to their thing. So I applaud the leadership of the big oil right now, where they're going. I hope that makes sense.
I think they have no choice. No, if they want to stay relevant, if they want to get financing, if they want to have a bank account, I think one of the interesting developments this year is that starting yesterday, January 1st, the EU's new sustainability and climate accounting has come into force for fairly large corporations, which will affect all of the oil and gas companies. And so since they have to account for scope 3 emissions, which is how people use their products, they have to be responsible for the CO2 emissions of how people use oil and gas. That increases what their emissions profile is, which will then affect how much money they have to spend on offsets or any of these other things. And so I think 2024 will be a very interesting year for the balance books of oil and gas companies, European ones, at least that are headquarters in the EU, because they're going to have to account for all of these things. Now, BP, for example, has a joint project, I believe it's with Shell, where they've got 3 different carbon capture and hydrogen production sites that are moving forward in the UK and what's called the Teesside project. And they're getting some government subsidies to do this. They want some assurances that there will be some kind of carbon trading regime, that they can somehow make money, instead of just sinking it all into the ground. So it'll be interesting to see how this moves forward. But the governments, as I said at the outset, are really making it so the companies have no choice but to walk down these pathways. Otherwise, they can't really exist, or they can't get financing, they can't get insurance, even though they're producing something that is absolutely essential for how we live our lives and make our lives affordable and enjoyable.
David, do you see more mergers and acquisitions this year, and especially for the green side of the oil companies?
Well, there will definitely be more mergers and acquisitions, particularly in the U.S. shale space, because economies of scale are just so important to profitability in that area of the business. And there's always mergers and acquisitions to some extent. But yes, I think becoming greener and more ESG friendly is becoming a more and more important factor in evaluating mergers and acquisitions. For example, we saw ExxonMobil acquired Denbury last summer. And Denbury, of course, had this vast network, 7,000 miles, I think, of carbon dioxide pipelines in place already that are pretty handy for the big carbon capture and storage projects that ExxonMobil has big plans for along the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast. So that was just a synergy between those two companies and made all kinds of sense. And I think you'll see more and more of that as time goes on, when companies like Exxon and BP and Shell are developing hydrogen hubs. And there's going to be companies out there, third-party vendor companies that have assets that are really convenient for making those projects work. And so you'll see those companies start gobbling up those third-party companies. And it makes it, the other aspect of all that is by doing that, it makes it easier for these big companies to track those, Category 3 emissions. It's not Category 3. What's it called?
Scope 3.
Scope 3 emissions. I'm sorry. I apologize.
It's like a hurricane.
Right. But if you own all the infrastructure and you own everything cradle to grave until the product gets on a ship or goes to an end user, it just makes it easier to account for the scope 3 emissions. And so I just think we're going to probably, the pace of mergers and acquisitions will continue to increase this year, certainly in the United States.
Armand and David, great points, David. The other big one was Occidental and Crown Rock, and Michael Tanner and I did an evaluation of that deal, and everybody was saying that Oxy overpaid for Crown Rock. But then when I looked at the whole infrastructure and about it, I found that there were that Oxy already had CO2 wells, and the wells that were offsetting wells in everything that we looked at was one of the main reasons that right after that happened, you had Warren Buffett buy millions and millions more. And during that transition, so you're going to see that, and you're also going to see the more greener investments out of those guys, if that makes sense.
Yep. So from our conversation today, I have 3 points that pay my attention. The first one is natural gas should not be, let's see, forgotten. It's so important, and you are not doing the right approach for natural gas. The second point, Stuart, pipelines. This is a fantastic solution that we are not, let's say, attributing the right approach for that. And the third, David, really the U.S. lost the opportunity to make South America, North America good relationship, Temi, and they lost, the United States lost to Russia and China.
Yeah, I think that's right. I
Any
agree
other
with all
points?
those.
Well,
It's going to be a heck of a year.
yeah, the last point about hemispheric energy being an energy superpower. I mean, that was talked about in the early 2000s. It was one of the sort of talking points between George W. Bush and the Canadian government and Mexico. And they wanted to create this kind of powerhouse fortress North America and eventually bring South America into it so that there could be this very strong hemispheric power. And that was all undermined by the climate movement. And so you
Yes.
have to ask yourself, whose interest is it to undermine Western hemispheric energy security?
Gosh, who might that be?
Who might
country
benefit from that,
benefit?
right?
Let me think.
Because, I mean, you look at the billions that have been funneled into the climate movement, and there was an inquiry in Canada regarding some of the finances, or at least what they could uncover, looking at the accounting and so on. And there's a lot of murky things going on there. So, and I think there was a congressional investigation as well regarding some of the dark money, the dark green money that gets cycled through things. So,
That's right.
That was undermined.
Fantastic conversation with Professor Stuart Turley, my good friend David Blackman, and Dr. Temi Nemeth. And waiting for Irina Slav next week.
All right.
Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you so much, Armando.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Y'all have a great week. Happy
Thanks,
New Year,
David.
everybody.
Thanks, Stu. Bye.
Fine.
Bye.
See you guys. Talk to you soon. I can't find the button here.